Richard Ramirez was born in El Paso, Texas on February 29, 1960. The city, known for its vibrant culture and close-knit communities, was a stark contrast to the dark path Richard would eventually take. He was the youngest of 7 children, growing up in a bustling household filled with the noise and chaos of a large family. His parents, Julian and Mercedes Ramirez, were Mexican immigrants who had come to America seeking a better life. They worked tirelessly to provide for their children, instilling in them the values of hard work and perseverance. However, Richard's childhood was far from idyllic. Despite their efforts, the Ramirez household was fraught with tension and strife. His father, Julian, was a World War II veteran and a strict disciplinarian. The war had left its mark on him, and he struggled to adjust to civilian life. Julian was known to be physically and verbally abusive, often taking out his frustrations on his children. The constant fear and anxiety created a toxic environment for young Richard. Richard's troubled home life cast a long shadow over his formative years. He often felt isolated and misunderstood, retreating into his own world to escape the turmoil around him. Violence became a familiar specter in the Ramirez household. The frequent outbursts and confrontations left deep emotional scars on Richard. Adding to the chaos was his older cousin, Miguel, a decorated Green Beret who had served in the Vietnam War. Miguel would regale Richard with gruesome stories from the battlefield, tales that were far too graphic for a young boy to hear. Miguel even showed Richard Polaroid pictures of his victims, images that were both horrifying and mesmerizing to the impressionable child. One photo in particular showed Miguel posing with a Vietnamese woman he had beheaded. This image seared itself into Richard's mind, a haunting reminder of the brutality humans are capable of. These images and stories deeply disturbed the young Richard, planting the seeds of darkness that would later grow into a monstrous obsession with violence and death. Richard's childhood was marred by poverty and instability. The family moved frequently. Richard often witnessed his father's violent outbursts. He was also subjected to physical abuse himself. By the time Richard was a teenager, he was already exhibiting disturbing behavior. He was withdrawn and prone to fits of rage. Richard's cousin Miguel continued to be a negative influence. Miguel introduced Richard to drugs and alcohol. He also taught him how to break into houses and hotwire cars. In 1973, when Richard was 13, he witnessed Miguel shoot and kill his wife during a domestic dispute. Richard was traumatized by the event. He became increasingly withdrawn and isolated. As Richard entered adolescence, his life spiraled further into darkness. He began experimenting with drugs and alcohol, seeking solace from his turbulent reality. His academic performance plummeted, and he eventually dropped out of Jefferson High School in the 9th grade. It was during this period that Richard's interest in Satanism took hold. He became fascinated by the occult and the macabre. He began dabbling in rituals and embracing satanic imagery. This newfound fascination would later become a chilling hallmark of his crimes. In 1978, at the age of 18, Richard Ramirez left El Paso and drifted to California. He was searching for something, though he didn't know what. The open road seemed to promise freedom, a chance to escape his past and start anew. He settled in the Los Angeles area, a sprawling metropolis that would become his hunting ground. The city, with its glittering lights and dark shadows, offered both anonymity and opportunity. It was a place where dreams and nightmares coexisted. Ramirez's life in Los Angeles was chaotic and transient. He moved from place to place, never staying long enough to form connections. The city's constant motion mirrored his own restless spirit. He lived in cheap hotels and flophouses, places where the walls were thin and the nights were long. These were the shadows of the city, where the forgotten and the lost found refuge. He supported himself through petty theft and drug dealing. Each crime was a small rebellion against a society he felt had abandoned him. The streets became his school, teaching him the harsh lessons of survival. It was during this period that Ramirez began to fantasize about violence and control. His mind, already scarred by a troubled past, started to twist and turn in darker directions. The line between fantasy and reality began to blur. He was drawn to the city's underbelly, immersing himself in a world of drugs, crime, and depravity. The neon lights of the seedy parts of town became his guiding stars, leading him deeper into the abyss. As his fantasies grew darker, they began to bleed into reality. The sinister thoughts that once only lived in his mind started to manifest in his actions. The city, with all its hidden corners, became his playground. His troubled childhood, marked by violence, instability, and exposure to extreme trauma, had left an indelible mark on his psyche. The demons of his past were never far behind, always whispering in his ear, pushing him further down a path of destruction. Section 5. Terror grips the City of Angels. On June 28, 1984, Richard Ramirez embarked on a reign of terror that would grip Los Angeles in fear for over a year. Known as the Night Stalker, Ramirez's crimes were not only brutal but also seemingly random, making the entire city feel vulnerable and on edge. His first known victim was 79-year-old Jenny Vincow, who was sexually assaulted, stabbed repeatedly, and murdered in her own home. This heinous act marked the beginning of a series of violent crimes that would leave a lasting scar on the community. Over the next 14 months, Ramirez terrorized the city. Residents lived in constant fear, taking extra precautions to secure their homes. The sense of safety that once existed in neighborhoods was shattered. He broke into homes in the dead of night, attacking his victims while they slept. The randomness of his attacks made it impossible to predict where he would strike next, adding to the widespread panic. His crimes were shocking in their brutality and randomness. Each attack seemed more vicious than the last, leaving both the police and the public desperate for answers. He targeted men, women, and children of all ages and races. No one felt safe as Ramirez showed no pattern in choosing his victims, making everyone a potential target. He shot, stabbed, beat, and raped his victims. The sheer variety of his methods made it difficult for law enforcement to track him down. He mutilated their bodies and often left satanic symbols at the crime scenes. These disturbing markings added an element of psychological terror, suggesting a deeper, more sinister motive behind his actions. The community came together in an attempt to protect themselves, holding meetings and discussing safety measures. Despite their efforts, the fear lingered as Ramirez continued to evade capture. Law enforcement worked tirelessly, piecing together clues and following leads. The pressure to catch the Night Stalker was immense, as each day without an arrest meant another day of fear for the residents of Los Angeles. The city mourned the loss of each victim, holding candlelight vigils and praying for an end to the nightmare. The collective grief and anxiety were palpable, as everyone hoped for justice to be served. Section 6. A chaotic investigation. The Los Angeles Police Department faced immense pressure to catch the Night Stalker, as Ramirez came to be known. However, the investigation was hampered by the seemingly random nature of his crimes. He had no apparent modus operandi, striking different neighborhoods and choosing victims seemingly at random. The lack of a consistent pattern made it difficult for investigators to develop a profile of the killer. Adding to the challenge was the media frenzy surrounding the case. Every new attack was splashed across newspapers and television screens, fueling public fear and speculation. Section 7. The Night Stalker's reign ends. On August 31, 1985, Richard Ramirez's reign of terror came to an end in a dramatic confrontation in East Los Angeles. After attempting to carjack a woman, Ramirez was chased down and apprehended by a group of angry citizens. The capture was a testament to the power of community vigilance. Residents, terrorized for months, had been on high alert. When Ramirez's face was plastered across newspapers and television screens, they were ready to act. Section 8. Justice in the courtroom. Richard Ramirez's trial began in July 1988. It was a media spectacle with reporters and spectators from around the world flocking to the Los Angeles courtroom. The prosecution presented a mountain of evidence against Ramirez, including eyewitness testimony, DNA evidence, and ballistic evidence. Despite the overwhelming evidence against him, Ramirez remained defiant throughout the trial. He often smiled and winked at the cameras, reveling in the notoriety. On September 20, 1989, the jury found Richard Ramirez guilty on 43 counts, including 13 counts of murder, 5 counts of attempted murder, 11 counts of sexual assault, and 14 counts of burglary. Section 9. Condemned to death row. Following his conviction, Richard Ramirez was sentenced to death. He was sent to San Quentin State Prison to await execution. Despite facing his own mortality, Ramirez remained unrepentant. He continued to espouse satanic beliefs. He even married one of his many supporters, Doreen Leoy, in a prison ceremony in 1996. On June 7, 2013, Richard Ramirez died of natural causes at Marin General Hospital in Green Bay, California, at the age of 53. He had spent 23 years on death row. His death brought a sense of closure to the families of his victims, but the scars of his crimes remained. Section 10. Remembering the victims. The victims of Richard Ramirez were not just names on an indictment. They were real people with lives, loves, and dreams. They were parents, children, siblings, and friends. Their loss left an immeasurable void in the lives of those who knew and loved them. It is essential to remember and honor the victims of Richard Ramirez and all victims of violent crime. Their stories serve as a reminder of the human cost of violence and the importance of seeking justice. We must never forget their names or the terror they endured. Section 11. The Scars of Trauma. The case of Richard Ramirez offers a chilling glimpse into the dark side of human nature. It also raises important questions about the role of childhood trauma in shaping criminal behavior. While it is impossible to excuse Ramirez's actions, it is essential to acknowledge the profound impact of his upbringing.